Well, it's a great pleasure to be back again. In yesterday's lecture, with Galileo as a prime mover, I examined one of the most striking features of 17th century science, and that was the shift from organic to mechanistic conceptions of nature. However disconcerting the theological concerns that were raised in the process, I suggested that the new science did not undermine the belief that nature was the work of a providential creator. Indeed, mechanical models could reinforce the view that nature was a designed system, bearing witness to the wisdom and power of its maker. From Newton at the close of the 17th century to William Paley at the close of the 18th, analogies between nature and man-made machines were exploited in defense of religious belief. For Paley, whom we saw yesterday, living things were like impeccably designed clocks and watches, their parts beautifully adapted to their function. I'd just like to show you a little collage from an illustrated edition of Paley, which I think does actually, have we not moved on? There we are. This just shows you the sort of elements in nature that Paley celebrated. The beautifully designed beak of the woodpecker, which enabled it to get those insects out from the bark of trees. The webbed feet of those birds that swim. And for any creature, Paley could find something, usually many things, that indicated how well it had been designed for its particular ecological niche. Paley's work also stressed, and this is important, that design can be found in the laws of nature and not simply in detailed contrivances. And that's going to be important in this lecture, because Darwin thought the same, certainly for a long time, until his most agnostic phase. So let's move forward. Those were 18th century figures, of course, David Hume and Immanuel Kant, who critiqued the design argument, but who couldn't quite, I think, shake off the psychological power of an argument which said that if nature is machine-like, then it must have some kind of transcendent maker. And it's interesting that Hume, in his famous critique of natural theology, played on the organic images of nature, saying if nature were like an organism, then the cause of nature could be an egg or a seed or something like that. But if it's a machine, you are stuck with the anthropomorphic analogy, to be sure, but one that could be quite persuasive. Because in today's lecture, I want to consider another striking transformation from nature as machine to nature as historical process. It's during the 19th century that sciences such as geology and evolutionary biology presented a view of the past in which the age of the Earth was extended into staggering depths of time. The fossil record revealed a succession of living forms, many of which had become extinct. Well, we found the extinct giant sloth now, so that's a moment's progress. We'll see how this goes. And this discovery of so many extinct forms raised new questions about nature's supposed beneficence. Speculative theories of evolution, like those of the Frenchman Lamarck and the Edinburgh publisher Robert Chambers, let's see if we can conjure them into being, there we are, they preceded Darwin's more cogent formulation of evolution in 1859. Of course, Darwin's achievement, as you know, was to provide an explanation for what John Herschel, great astronomer, had called the mystery of mysteries, the successive appearance of new species. If new forms came from pre-existing species by a process in which advantageous variations were accumulated by natural selection, then, quite simply, independent acts of creation were not required. For anti-clerical naturalists, the plausibility of Darwin's theory was a welcome gift. Thomas Henry Huxley, one of Darwin's disciples, often called Darwin's bulldog, Huxley chastised himself for not having had the thought of evolution by natural selection himself. He said, I can't think why the idea didn't come to me. It's one of those ideas when once you've got it into your head, it seems all so obvious. For Huxley, it's an antidote to divine... there we've got Huxley. For Huxley, it's an antidote to divine intervention in nature and to the long-cherished belief that species had been separately and meticulously designed. Because natural selection was a perfecting process, and this is very important, because natural selection was a perfecting process, as minor improvements accumulated over eons of time, it created the illusion of design. Darwin in old age made the uncompromising assertion in his autobiography, the old argument of Paley fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. And it's because the appearance of design is illusory. Many discussions of science and religion in the 19th century have been structured around this antithesis between Darwin and Paley. It's easy to grasp, and it conforms, of course, to the pervasive conflict model for the relations between science and religion. But it can give rise to inferences and caricatures that need correction. And 4 of these, I think, deserve special scrutiny. And I'm going to talk about these today. One of the 4 is that during the first half of the 19th century, natural theology was stuck in the Paley mold until Darwin delivered the death blow. Historicizing nature had simply made any realistic revision impossible. A second misleading inference would be that for his science, Darwin gained nothing from Paley and the natural theologians. A third is the assumption that Darwin's rejection of Christianity and his eventual agnosticism were direct consequences of his theory. The fourth I associate with Richard Dawkins, that Darwin's defeat of Paley so undermined a major pillar of Christianity that we should expect only hostility from clerical leaders. But I think it's worth examining each of these inferences in turn, because in correcting them, I think we can gain insight into Darwin himself and the reception of his theory. So, natural theology before 1859. In a valuable essay on natural theology, our chairman this evening has provided a very helpful taxonomy for its theological character and function. Understood as an enterprise in which the existence and attributes of God are inferred on the basis of reason without recourse to revelation, it can have different manifestations and motivation according to context. It might be a vehicle for attacks on revelation, as one finds with the deists of the early 18th century, because they claimed that God was more vividly revealed in nature than in the often obscure and contradictory pages of Scripture. Or natural theology might be invoked to provide independent and prior proof of the kind of deity from whom a trustworthy revelation was to be expected. And interestingly, Paley saw his natural theology in that light. It's a kind of prelude to taking revelation seriously. Among other types, David has identified a grander role for natural theology when used in Christian apologetics to remove objections to the faith, to defeat the defeaters, in a well-known phrase. And then there's the more modest type of natural theology, where the aim is simply to show that the essential claims of revelation are compatible with knowledge from other sources, such as the natural sciences. For scientists themselves, addressing the suspicion of religious detractors, natural theology could have yet another function, and that's to justify and promote their science by showing that far from undermining faith, it's spiritually edifying. This was a belief shared by the two Christian apologists I'd now like to introduce, whose involvement in the geological sciences shows how a revised natural theology could not only accommodate a historicized nature, but also turn it to advantage. I'm thinking of the Cambridge geologist Adam Sedgwick, affectionately known as the first of men, friend and mentor of the young Darwin. And secondly, somebody who may be familiar to many of you, the Scottish evangelical Hugh Miller, the stonemason of Cromarty, who was editor of The Witness, organ of the Free Church following the disruption, took his place among Edinburgh littérateurs. Now, such was Sedgwick's enthusiasm for geology that it was said of him he would hide his hammer up his sleeve in order not to shock the feelings of the Scotchman on Sunday. But as a cleric who became vice master of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a canon residentiary at Norwich Cathedral, Sedgwick also looked for sermons in stones. And there they were in the fossil record. Sedgwick certainly saw himself as a defeater of the defeaters. One group was the atheists, who liked to argue that all living things had existed from eternity. The other group was those who viewed geology with religious suspicion, preferring to deduce their science directly from Scripture. Now, Sedgwick believed that the geologist's hammer could smash the atheist, because what the fossil record proved was that all living things had not existed from eternity. One could actually locate the periods within Earth history when each and every one had first appeared. Progressive creation rather than eternal forms, could be read from the data. This next slide is not very good, but it just conveys schematically the notion of a succession of geological epochs in which there are characteristic fossil forms and therefore reconstructed living things peculiar to each epoch. Hugh Miller also has to defeat two sets of defeaters. Secularists who claim that geology undermined the Genesis account of creation, and the English evangelicals who, in their denunciation of geology, showed they lacked the fibre of the Scots. Miller's natural theology took several forms as he championed a vigorous piety in which man was co-worker with his maker. Of one mind they would labour together for the improvement of creation. Miller's bold vision of cosmic and human progression was underpinned by the belief that, made in the image of God, men could share the same aesthetic sensibilities with their creator. And geology helped to make the case. The burden of Miller's book, The Testimony of the Rocks, was that nature was more like architecture than machinery. The same motifs and architectonic principles that humans incorporate into their buildings were to be found in fossil forms that existed long before humans had arrived. There was a common beauty that was not merely the result of imitation. In many cases, the salient architectural principles had been implemented by human beings before they had been discovered in the rocks. And a favorite example was the ammonite shell. The partitions between the chambers combined great lightness with great powers of resistance. And the interior arches reminded Miller of what he called the groined ribs of a Gothic cathedral. Now, as an adopted Lancastrian, I'm talking about myself, not Miller, as an adopted Lancastrian, I can't resist the anecdotal example with which Miller actually capped his argument. It concerned the calico printing industry with which Lancashire was associated in the middle years of the 19th century. And Miller observed that one pattern, known as Lane's net, had been a bestseller. And it had led to many imitations. But the most striking imitation was to be found in Smithia pengelii, a coral of the old red sandstone. The beautifully arranged lines, Miller wrote, which so smit the dames of England, had been stamped amid the rocks long before. The fact that no dames had then been around to appreciate them only confirmed that the patterns evinced the tastes of the divine designer to be later shared by humankind. As for harmonizing God's two books, Miller produced an extremely elaborate scheme in which the Genesis days of creation corresponded to specific geological epochs. And broadly speaking, the order of creation was the same in Genesis as in geology. And as for preserving a distinctively evangelical theology, Miller presented evidence of upward progression in the creatures introduced at the start of each new epoch. But within those epochs, this had been followed by degeneration. It's an ingenious move which had the advantage for Miller of scotching, if you'll forgive the pun, of scotching incipient evolutionary theories that blithely assumed continuous upward progression. And many of the earliest versions of evolution, though not Darwin's, many of them just rather blithely assume that evolution heads upwards. I'm not wishing to imply that in any way Miller's natural theology was not vulnerable to Darwin's theory. In fact, quite the contrary, because I think what it does, by invoking miraculous intervention to insert new species at the dawn of each epoch, Miller's vision of the past precisely pinpoints the damage that Darwin's continuity thesis would inflict. It was the fact that science had so long been on the side of the angels that goes a long way to explain why Darwin's theory would prove so shocking. Nevertheless, both Sedgwick and Miller show us how natural theology could and did embrace historical perspectives before Darwin's theory was published. So the second of my caricatures, and we need to look at Darwin's debt to natural theology. Did Darwin learn nothing from this enterprise? Did he deliberately set out to subvert it? It's a tempting view. We know the origins of Darwin's origin lie with observations he made while voyaging the world on HMS Beagle. The geographical distribution of species was paramount as Darwin reflected on questions like this. Why do the species on oceanic islands most closely resemble those of the nearest mainland? Why is that? Why in an archipelago like the Galapagos do the various islands have their own distinctive species? Now, you might have expected to see a finch, but there's one of the tortoises, and I put it up deliberately because, well, not only, of course, because the Galapagos are named after these fellows, but because Darwin had a critical clue given to him by the governor of one of the islands, Nicholas Lawson, who told him that just by looking at the shell of a tortoise, he could tell from which island it came. Before that, Darwin had muddled up a lot of his specimens. So a critical clue coming from a resident among the islands. So that's why you've got the tortoise there. Now we know that when Darwin returned home, it wasn't the reading of Paley, but of Thomas Malthus's essay on population. It was Malthusian arithmetic on potential population growth, compared with the limiting growth of resources, that helps Darwin to appreciate the intensity of an inexorable struggle for existence. And in this competitive struggle, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and the disadvantaged would be destroyed. In his study of variation, Darwin's primary course was to the effects achievable by domestic breeders, who, like the pigeon fanciers among whom he mingled, could manipulate and diversify the basic forms. Even a trained ornithologist, Darwin suggests in The Origin, would be inclined to regard them as separate species if he didn't know already that they were all descended from the common rock pigeon. They perform this very powerful rhetorical service for him, because if domestic breeders can exploit the plasticity of nature to that degree, then how much more might nature itself not be able to do, given sufficient time? So neither Darwin's evidence nor his rhetoric could suggest any obvious debt to natural theology. This is the point I've been making. And yet there were debts, and even to Paley, who'd fired his imagination when Darwin was a student in Cambridge. Speaking of the books he'd read as a prospective Anglican priest, Darwin confessed it was only Paley that later proved of any use. This is because, with countless examples, Paley made the study of adaptation so captivating. When Darwin devised his naturalistic explanation, he constantly used Paley as a sounding board to test the strength of his theory. During the 1830s, that's the decade of the voyage, as the Darwin expert David Cohn has argued, Darwin's ambition was not to destroy natural theology, but to reform it. And he wanted to see it grounded not in the display of disconnected examples of contrivance, but in the designed laws of nature. Now, there were even levels at which considerations drawn from natural theology actually shaped Darwin's theory. Even after he'd conceived his mechanism of natural selection, there were resonances with Paley. On the basis of natural selection, Darwin assumed that every structural feature of an organism has a use. Otherwise, why would it have been preserved? For Paley, every structural feature of an organism has a use, a function for which it had been designed. In his Descent of Man, Darwin admitted the theological influence because he wrote, "I was not able to annul the influence of my former belief, then almost universal, that each species had been purposely created, and this led to my tacit assumption that every detail of structure, excepting rudiments, was of some special, though unrecognized, service." It's an interesting feature of Darwinian evolutionary theory that a use can always be found, or can usually be found, if one is trying to explain why it's there. And there's another parallel we might note between Paley's world and that of Darwin. Paley has a section where he talks about God prescribing limits to his power. It's an interesting passage. And Paley writes, it's as though one being should have fixed certain rules and provided certain materials, and afterwards have committed to another being out of those materials, and in subordination to these rules, the task of drawing forth a creation. Paley doesn't actually adopt that view of God's relationship to nature, but he did say the subject may be safely represented under this view. There's no intrinsic theological objection to that. But isn't there a sense in which that became Darwin's view? Darwin still has a creator, that first being to whom Paley had referred. And doesn't Darwin give to natural selection the task of Paley's second being, the task of drawing forth a creation? Darwin even spoke of natural selection as if it were a being, a constantly vigilant being, scrutinizing the variations on which it would operate. It's a very interesting little philosophical question, the way Darwin personifies natural selection. Now, it's a rather abstract congruence, and I would accept that. But I mention it for a very particular reason, because it helps to underline the important insight of the historian of science, Susan Cannon. that Darwin did not so much destroy the universe of the natural theologians as steal it from them. It's a very subtle difference. It's a very subtle difference, but a very important distinction. What can we say about Darwin's religious odyssey? Was his eventual agnosticism a direct consequence of his evolutionary science? However plausible, that's another caricature. And in correcting it, the influential Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, there we are, proposed an equally extreme alternative. This is Wilson, writing in the Harvard Review. The great naturalist did not abandon Abrahamic and other religious dogmas because of his discovery of evolution by natural selection. The reverse occurred. The shedding of blind faith gave him the intellectual fearlessness to explore human evolution wherever logic and evidence took him. Now, the trouble is, both those interpretations are misleading, in my view. They also trade, of course, on that same assumption, that of some inherent conflict between a science of evolution and religious belief. The reality was more complex, and we need a more balanced view. On his great voyage of discovery between 1831 and 1836, I just put that up to remind you what an incredible circumnavigation it really was. Darwin had formative experiences that shaped his views on religion throughout his life. He'd been told by his cousin Hensley Wedgwood that there is a fundamental difference between humans and the animal creation. Humans alone had an innate sense of God. But in his encounter with the natives of Tierra del Fuego, the South Pacific and Australasia, Darwin saw little evidence of that supposed innate sensibility. Comparing the different stages of religious development in the cultures he encountered, he actually developed an abiding interest in how belief in a spirit world originated and how it evolved. He never surrendered the view that some forms of religion were nobler than others, nor did he ever doubt that the golden rule was the highest expression of moral principle. What I think we do find is that his resistance to Christianity arose from an existential experience. But just before we get to that, there was a respect in which scientific curiosity did have a bearing on his thinking about religion. And I'd like just to bring Emma Wedgwood into the picture, because in a touching and prophetic letter written just before their marriage, Emma anticipates that her husband's commitment to the rigorous examination of evidence might corrode beliefs that were less well attested. And she tries to drag out of him what his favorite biblical verses are, so that she can cling to those, almost as if she is anticipating the loss of faith which did actually follow. Darwin would eventually write, "The more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become." For his positive rejection of Christianity, though, we do have to look elsewhere. And this is to ethical and existential concerns. In his autobiography, Darwin later wrote that he could hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. And that's his most severe anti-Christian blast. And he's certainly not thinking about incompatibility with science. The issue was coherence with a civilized morality. And his target was the doctrine of eternal damnation for the unregenerate. Free thinkers outside the Christian fold, but inside his own family, were destined for eternal perdition if this doctrine were true. Now, these included his evolutionist grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and his brother, Erasmus. At risk was Darwin's father, Robert, whom Darwin describes as the biggest man I ever saw. When, in the late 1840s, his father died, the question of his destiny has a disturbing immediacy. And Darwin is not alone among Victorian intellectuals in believing that the doctrine of eternal damnation should itself be eternally damned. For some scholars, notably James Moore, there in his book jointly authored with Adrian Desmond, for some scholars, another death in the family marked the real watershed in Darwin's engagement with Christianity. When early in March 1851, his 10-year-old daughter Annie fell ill, Darwin took her to his physician in Malvern. Emma stayed behind because she was in the 8th month of one of her many pregnancies. But very poignant letters passed between them as Charles reports every nuance of Annie's fever. And then, after all the ups and downs, the desolating news of her death. And it's impossible to read those letters without shedding tears with them. Why should so innocent a child suffer? Her conduct, even during her illness, was described as angelic. What pattern could possibly be discerned in such human tragedies? If concerns about the eternal destiny of Darwin's father had, in Moore's words, spiked Christianity, Annie's death clinched the matter. That's Moore's well-known thesis. Henceforward, Darwin would worry about God and pain and immortality, unencumbered by the Christian plan of redemption. Now, interestingly, Moore's thesis has recently been sharply criticized on the grounds of inadequate evidence. And I just mentioned that because that thesis has percolated through a lot of the Darwin literature. And there certainly were other springs of his disenchantment with Christianity, one of which was incredulity concerning any claim for divine revelation. But Annie's death is poignant because it's a special case of a problem Darwin experienced in other contexts: how to find meaning in accidental particularities. And this was a question he put to the Harvard botanist Asa Gray. Darwin asks whether Gray really believed that if a man sheltering under a tree is struck by lightning, has he been killed by design? Many do believe that, says Darwin, but I can't, and I really do want to know what you think. Whether in Darwin's rejection of Christianity Annie's death was a prime cause or merely the last straw is actually hard to judge. But another biographer, Randall Keynes, has identified what for him is the crux of the matter, and I quote, "For Darwin, it was easier to come to terms with pain and suffering if there was no question of a divine purpose ruling over the life and death of individuals you cared for. At the time Darwin wrote his Origin of Species, he's best described as a deist, still believing in a transcendent creator whose laws had been impressed on the universe. Darwin could still see in nature's history the fulfillment of a moral purpose, and this is important, a moral purpose in the creation of the higher animals and the human capacity for moral awareness and responsibility. But during the last 20 years of his life, he did become increasingly agnostic, though by his own admission, his views often fluctuated. Some seeds of that agnosticism can be found in his science and in yet another reconception of nature. In the historical processes that had produced Earth's flora and fauna, there was a large element of chance, or so it appeared. The variations on which natural selection worked appeared randomly and were usually deleterious. And this made it impossible for Darwin to agree with Asa Gray that novel variations were micromanaged by the deity. Whatever their cause, to say that they had appeared providentially with a prospective use in mind was an unwarranted imposition on the theory. Darwin's portrayal of nature at war with itself, a nature red in tooth and claw, further accentuates the problem of suffering. Doubtless, with memories of Annie, Darwin considered the presence of so much pain and suffering in the world to be one of the most powerful arguments against a beneficent deity. And yet, and this is the critical line that it's in the same sentence, and yet that suffering is to be expected on my theory of natural selection. In his autobiography, Darwin notes that human suffering has often been rationalized as conducive to moral improvement. But that simply didn't work as an argument when contemplating the great suffering of animals. Now, in one last crucial respect, Darwin's science contributed to his agnosticism. It even provides a justification for it. If the human mind is itself the product of evolutionary processes, can it be trusted to reach definitive conclusions on metaphysical and theological matters? On the big questions of meaning, purpose, and the existence of God, Darwin finally became unsure whether he should believe even his own convictions. It was sometimes said that agnostics were not supposed to have convictions. Darwin did have them. He'd experienced the extreme difficulty, he writes, or rather impossibility, of conceiving this immense and wonderful universe, including man, as the result of blind chance or necessity. But here's the problem, and I'm quoting Darwin again. Can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, can it be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? Interesting argument. Let's move on. Darwin denied ever having been an atheist, in the sense of denying the existence of a God. He was genuinely aggrieved when his science was appropriated for atheist rhetoric. When his science is retrospectively interpreted as entailing atheism, there's a real danger of misinterpreting the religious reaction. There was certainly no sharp divide between a scientific community entirely on Darwin's side and religious bodies marshalled against. Once again, popular anecdotes can be damaging, and I hesitate to mention the incident of the British Association meeting in Oxford in 1860, when Huxley and Bishop Soapy Sam Wilberforce had their spat. I hesitate to mention it because I think you've probably all heard about this, but thinking he might score a point against Wilberforce, or rather, Wilberforce thinking he might score a point against the young guard Darwinians, rather unwisely baited Huxley by asking whether he'd prefer to have an ape for an ancestor on his grandfather's or his grandmother's side. Huxley allegedly rubbed his hands with glee and whispered to his neighbor, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." In response to the bishop, Huxley said he would rather have an ape for an ancestor than a man who used his privileged position to pronounce on matters of which he was ignorant. It's a palpable hit. And this irreverent riposte supposedly caused a sensation. Huxley and science triumphant over obscurantist religion. Except there's a lot of mythology here. Wilberforce was an able critic of the weak points in Darwin's theory, as Darwin himself acknowledged. He quizzes me, sorry, that's Huxley, isn't it? Did we just zoom? No, there we are. Let's stay there for a moment. Wilberforce is an able critic of the weak points in Darwin's theory. He quizzes me quite splendidly, says Darwin. Wilberforce also believed that he had the best science on his side, and even the most sympathetic of Huxley's biographers has ridiculed the idea that Huxley scored a victory. Now, we can just move on to that other image of Huxley, whose own account of the reception of Darwin's theory is, I think, an embarrassment for the claim that theism and the argument from design had been undermined. Darwin's theory, says Huxley, has no more to do with theism than had the first book of Euclid, meaning no relevance at all. And Huxley made a point of saying that there'd been far too great a palaver about the question of design, as there still is, of course. Now, certainly, Paley's argument from separate contrivances in nature to a divine contriver, that argument, Huxley says, is now obsolete, of course. But he sees no problem with what he calls a wider teleology that was not touched by evolution. Why could there not have been design in the primordial nebulosity from which the universe and the Earth's fauna have evolved? Huxley even locates the structure of that argument in Paley himself, who, in Huxley's words, not in the Archbishop of Canterbury's words, in Huxley's words, had proleptically accepted the modern doctrine of evolution. Paley, thus rehabilitated, is, I think, a rather different figure from the one to whom we've grown accustomed. Now, there's even more mythology if Wilberforce is taken to be representative of theological opinion. On the day following his brush with Huxley, a sermon was preached in Oxford by another Anglican clergyman, Frederick Temple, a future Archbishop of Canterbury, and it was rather topically entitled "The Present Relations Between Science and Religion." It's the day after the British Association encounter. Temple's message was far more amenable to Darwin's theory and to extending the scope of natural laws, all the greater support for the reality of moral laws. Temple even warned of the dangers to theology if it persisted in trying to capitalize on what science could not yet explain. Temple had been one of Wilberforce's ordinands and was also one of the essayists in the controversial volume Essays and Reviews. And Wilberforce detested this liberal excursion into historical criticism of the Bible even more than he detested the origin of species. But the division of opinion between himself and Temple was one of many in the Anglican Church concerning the acceptability of Darwin's science. And one severe critic was his old friend, Adam Sedgwick, there on the left. Sedgwick protested about Darwin's deletion of final causes. But at the same time, another of Darwin's Cambridge mentors, the Reverend John Henslow, leapt to Darwin's defense. Henslow reports, "I got up and stuck up for Darwin as well as I could, refusing to allow that he was guided by any but truthful motives, and declaring that he himself believed he was exalting and not debasing our views of a creator." That's another division in the theological response. At Harvard, the Swiss naturalist and idealist Louis Agassiz, let's just... No, I think we've overshot. No, we haven't. At Harvard, the Swiss naturalist and idealist Louis Agassiz fought a rearguard campaign against Darwin's science. But in the same institution at Harvard, Asa Gray did more than anyone in the US to commend Darwin's concept of natural selection to an audience that certainly needed reassurance. At Princeton, Charles Hodge recoils at the randomness intrinsic to the Darwinian mechanism, but the principal, James McCosh, there on the right, was a convert to evolution and quite relaxed in his view. And I quote, "The prevalence of accident cannot be accidental." From my own review of Christian responses to Darwin, I would argue that the science of evolution was a divisive rather than a destructive force. Even within the same theological tradition, there were divergent reactions. David Livingstone has shown that among Presbyterians, the particular character of the responses depended very much on local contexts. There was more hostility in Belfast than in Edinburgh, and less in Princeton than in either. To get a grip on the post-Darwinian debates, we must also be aware of a crucial distinction. Put crudely, it's the distinction between the fact of evolution, this is the only diagram in The Origin of Species, the distinction between the fact of evolution, the idea of common descent from common ancestors, that biological diversity comes from divergence from common ancestors. That's the fact of evolution, if you like. But there's a difference between that and the mechanism proposed to explain it. And that distinction is fundamental if we're going to understand the theological commentaries. Whereas Darwin's long argument in The Origin converted many to the reality of common descent, his mechanism of natural selection was to remain controversial for many years, arguably until the neo-Darwinian synthesis with genetics in the 1930s. Among religious commentators, a common pattern was to accept evolution, but to reject reject or modify Darwin's mechanism. And it's not too difficult to do that because Darwin himself qualified the importance he'd given to natural selection in the first edition of his book. And we can see this strategy in two Scottish commentators, George Campbell, the 8th Duke of Argyll, and then Henry Drummond, the evangelical author of The Ascent of Man. Campbell had no quarrels with the idea of evolution, ascribing it to the operation of divine laws. But during his presidency of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, he did snipe at natural selection. How, for example, could it possibly account for the beauty of a hummingbird? It's a nice little picture. I hope it's showing up, but that was the ornithologist John Gould's little case of those beautiful birds. Henry Drummond drew the fire of other evangelicals when he embraced evolution, but he insisted that the concept of a struggle for life had to be supplemented with a struggle for the life of others, as with a mother's love and care for a child. And that's an argument that almost presages Sarah Coakley's account of evolutionary altruism in her recent Gifford lectures. There were even those who, having been enthusiastic converts to Darwin's theory, subsequently reneged on the mechanism. One of the fiercest critics of natural selection was the Catholic evolutionist, St. George Mivart. And Mivart's scientific apostasy was particularly galling to Huxley because Mivart had been one of his students. It was not difficult for Huxley to believe that Mivart's assault on natural selection was theologically motivated. And that brings us to a second distinction, germane to an understanding of Huxley and his fellow scientific polemicists. And this is the distinction between religion and theology. There's no doubt that Huxley had it in for the theological establishment, and especially for Roman Catholic theology. But he insists that he's no enemy to religion, understood as a more private form of spirituality in which one's duty is to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with one's God. So on the one hand, Huxley loved to say that strangled theologians lay around the cradle of every new science, like snakes around the body of Hercules. But on the other hand, he declares the antagonism between science and religion, about which we hear so much, and don't we, appears to me, says Huxley, purely factitious, meaning an artifact, fabricated. Fabricated, he says, by short-sighted religious people who confound theology with religion, and by equally short-sighted scientific people who forget that science takes for its province only that which is susceptible of clear intellectual comprehension. Well, if I might just have my closing 2 or 3 minutes, we have one last section, because I wanted to introduce you to 2 recent historical theses. Huxley's diagnosis, I think, invites this consideration. And I'm thinking, first of all, of Bernard Lightman, a historian of science at York University in Toronto, who's argued that much of the so-called conflict between science and religion was a conflict between different ways of harmonizing the two. And this is a very interesting way of looking at it, because even Huxley was trying to harmonize the two in his way. On topics such as theodicy, the reinterpretation of Scripture, God's immanence and human uniqueness, there was plenty of scope for discord among the harmonizers. And the Oxford theologian Aubrey Moore strongly believed, we can just find him, that nature's continuous creativity inscribed in biological evolution gave a superior account of God's presence than semi-deistic models in which God is inactive except when intervening. Under the guise of a foe, according to Moore, Darwin had done the work of a friend. An equally bold but divisive claim was that Darwin had also been a friend to Christianity by mitigating the theodicy problem. If the presence of suffering in nature had been a precondition of the very possibility of human evolution, then a greater degree of rationalization was possible. And Darwin himself had believed that his theory went some way to exonerating the Creator for the more devilish features of creation. A whole train of vile molluscous animals, Darwin says. If you believe in special creation, God has created those vile creatures separately and deliberately. If they could evolve in a process which was necessary to produce human beings, then you've got a slightly different take on the problem. Now, the second of the two theses I have in mind is that of Matthew Stanley in his recent book, Huxley's Church and Maxwell's Demon. Stanley recognized that there was a conflict involving science and religion in Victorian Britain. Of course there was. But to describe it as a conflict between science and religion gets it wrong. It was, for Stanley, rather a conflict between two kinds of science. I hinted at this in the discussion last night. The older kind Stanley calls theistic science. It's the science of Wilberforce. The newer was the naturalistic science of Huxley and other members of his church scientific. Darwin facilitates the transition from the one to the other. The real issue concerned how religious ideas and values should appear in scientific practice, if at all. And Stanley's argument is subtle because it depends on a contrast between two forms of science that differed very little, if at all, in their empirical methodology. In both the theistic and the naturalistic, there was commitment to the unity and uniformity of nature, to experimental methods, and to the quest for nature's laws. The difference lay in the metaphysical foundations of those methodological principles. Maxwell and Huxley are used by Stanley to illustrate the tension between two strongly opposed groups, who nevertheless, and I'm quoting from him now, argued for virtually the same foundational elements of science. And Stanley's thesis allows me finally to connect yesterday's lecture with today's, because we saw yesterday how science in the 17th century could properly be described as theistic. In the mechanization of nature, there was a unity to nature because it was the creation of one mind. It had a uniformity because it was sustained by an immutable divine will. An experimental method had been justified on the grounds that it was an expression of the Christian virtue of humility. In the very language of laws of nature, there was the assumption of divine legislation. Now, that theistic framework of science was still extant in Maxwell, as in Faraday immediately before him. For these unifiers of nature's forces, the unity of nature is a theological as well as a scientific concept. But in Huxley's naturalistic science, there was no need of the theology. As Hume had argued, you could give an account of nature's laws based simply on the uniformity of experience, without reference to a legal or a theological metaphor. Science could be conducted in a wholly secular spirit, as of course it largely is, almost exclusively so today. Appeals to the supernatural or to religious considerations of any kind were, in Huxley's view, superfluous and prejudicial to scientific inquiry. And Stanley's point is that exponents of the two rival frameworks for science strenuously maintained that only their own framework provided a secure foundation for a scientific culture. And that's where the conflict is. Now, there have been different views about how conclusively the 19th century proponents of naturalistic science won the argument, but it would be very hard to deny that methodological naturalism has come to dominate, even define, the culture of science. But there is, of course, a difference between keeping God out of science on principle and the view usually called ontological or metaphysical naturalism, that the nature we observe and interrogate is all that exists. It may not be a big jump from the success of the methodology to the reconception of nature as all that is. However, as I hope to show in Thursday's lecture, there were features of Einstein's universe that were to keep questions of transcendence alive. Thank you very much.